of trust in open societies?
Almost. Okay, no, it's basically what I'm talking about, but I thought that title would be a little bit more precise where I wanted to go to. Okay, so I will do, well, it's the last talk, so and I will do a very European thing. I will talk about politics and I will talk about Hegel. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do. Okay, and my question really is, if the nation is really a place of trust. Okay, so that's my question. Is the nation, if we have a nation, is the nation actually built on a spirit of trust? Okay, can a nation have trust, right? That's my question. And so how I was motivated to this talk was, let's say the political intuition was that I think we have let down people, right, over the last 2 decades, more or less. And these people, they think that nationalism can help them, right? That nationalism is the natural place where to look to when they are in despair and in trouble. And now the question is, if that's really the right place where we look to, okay? If they are right to look to that place for help, okay? And here I'm going to discuss with you Hegel, just because I think that Hegel is the only person who really has a theory of community and nation. Okay, so there's no other reason why I would do this to me and to you, but just because I think he has a very profound idea about the nation. Okay, so let me start now. So I think now this is just a form of a statement. Okay, and I think that globalization, migration, hurt the working class and the low-skilled workers in Western societies. Okay, I think I cannot, I think it's kind of intuitive, and I could argue for it logically, which I will not do. But there are people who have studied this, right, and who have written important books on this, like Roderick, Acemoglu, Piketty, and probably most importantly Milanovic. Okay, and none of them is supposed to be kind of a right-wing economist. They are all kind of left-wing economists, okay, and what they were analyzing and what they were seeing is that both globalization and migration are hurting the lower classes. Okay, now how do we answer to this, right? So there is one answer to this is left populism, right? And left populism says, okay, that's just part of the game. I mean, okay, so capitalists are going to screw us, and now we're going to screw them. Okay, that's the antagonist idea of democracy. Here, trust plays no role whatsoever because they don't believe that you can trust in the society, because society is about fighting for hegemony. Okay, so now the capitalists have won it. Now what we have to do is to fight back, and we have to win the game. But when we win the game, that we will suppress them. Okay. And I don't think that you can build really a society up on this, right? Because it's a little bit like when you screw your partner and he or she screws you, well, after some time you will split up, right? I mean, you won't continue to stay together. And I think societies is basically the same. Now there are the right populists, right? And the right populists, they take the fact that globalization and migration has hurt them, right? They take this much more personally, much more emotional. They're much emotional about it. It's not like the left populists say, okay, that's part of the game, rule of the game. They screw us and we will fight back. No, they really take it personally and emotionally. They really feel resentment towards those people in power to have allowed for those new inequalities and so forth, right? And now the question is if, one of the questions is if their resentment is justified, right? I mean, because a lot of liberals, like, they would just say, okay, they're just crazy people. I mean, we should, they feel resentment, right? They feel mistrust, but they're wrong about it because they don't understand public reason. They don't understand liberalism. They don't understand deliberative democracy, okay? Now, I think because that would be another part of the art. I mean, it would be another paper, but I just want to say this, that I think what I want to say is that they are justified, okay? That they're right to feel resentment and that they're right to feel mistrust, okay? And that this answer, the liberal, typical liberal answer, that it's kind of a very, I think it's a very smug attitude to say, okay, who is out, who, I mean, that politics is about who has the best argument in town, right? Or who has the most smart argument in town. I don't think that politics is about that. Okay, now, then the question is, if now, I go to the next slide because it's easier. So the question then is, right, if populists are right to believe that their fate, okay, that these inequalities have to do that people, that a certain elite, that they did not live up to their national obligations and to a national identity. Okay, that's the question. I mean, their idea would be, if they would have just lived up to those obligations which come from the nation, right, we would not be in this situation. And the idea is to say, okay, is that right? Now, I don't have a definite answer on this, and a little bit like Vince before, it's like I'm kind of torn. I think that they're wrong about this. Okay, intuitively, I think they're wrong about this, but I have to continue to thinking about this. And they're wrong about this for a very simple reason, is that trust is not about identity. Okay, trust is not about having a common identity, but trust is a notion in which you gain trust when you see that the other person has the evident intention to take your interest into account. Okay, and what is my take on this is that I believe that collective identity or national identity, it is not concerned with the well-being of people. Okay, so national obligations, since they are not concerned with the well-being of the individuals, with the interest of the individuals, it's not, the nation is not going to help those people who are right-wing populists today. Okay, that's what I'm trying to argue for. Now, trust in terms of identity is a little bit what Niels had said at the very beginning. So this is a quote from Hegel. You don't have to look at it, but it's simply the idea is that there is trust if you and me have shared values, more or less. Okay, if you and me share an identity about what we should do. Okay, now he puts it, whomsoever I trust, his certainty of himself is for me the certainty of my, anyway, it's a complicated language, but the language, it's simply to say that if between me and you, there is an identity in values, okay, so about our practical reasons, then there is trust, okay? That's the idea. Robert Brandom, he makes a lot out of this, and he puts it into a very obsessed way. And I'm not going to go into this, but he believes that, as a matter of fact, the fact that you share those values, that's the foundation of trust. Okay. Now there is a different understanding of trust. Okay, and a very different understanding of trust, which probably was theorized and conceptualized, I think, in its most brilliant way by John Rawls in a very early article, which is called The Sense of Justice, and which is taken, he has taken it in the theory of justice, you find the same ideas, okay? So what I refer here to the sense of justice, okay? And what Rawls says here, right, is that we develop trust simply, and he bases this on Rousseau, right? So that we develop trust simply if we know that the other person takes my well-being, my interests into account. That's the only foundation of trust. And obviously, in a marriage, this doesn't mean, for example, that we have to share all the values and all the ideas, right? The only thing that you have to be certain about is that when problems come up, when there are issues, that the other person is going to take into account your interests, okay? And that you're going to take into account her or his interest, okay? So that's the basis of trust. And And now, we didn't speak about this at all, but I think, I would go with the second idea of trust, right? Not with the first, not necessarily with the first idea of trust. And simply by the fact that I think that trust, if it comes phenomenologically what it is, I mean, if I open your mind and see, okay, so now you're a trusting person, so what's happening in your mind? It's just simply an emotion, okay? It's a complex emotion, it's a complicated emotion, and I'm not going into that, how it is actually composed through what kinds of other like basic emotions, but it is an emotion, it's nothing more. I mean, it's not a thought. It could be based upon some thought, but it is something which is much more basic. It is simply a feeling that you have that you can trust someone, okay? And that trust is an emotion, and the fact that it is an emotion, it shows that trust is to be closely related to the well-being of the self, right? So, since emotions, they are about our well-being, okay? They are there, we have emotions in order to preserve ourselves, okay? And given that trust is an emotion, it means also that we feel it, that trust, then our well-being is at stake. So I think that the fact that it is an emotion shows that the second understanding of it, that it is understood in terms of interest, is the right one, okay? Now, now Hegel there is a different quote that I could take here, but it's not, again, it's not important that you read it, okay? Where he has a more qualified understanding of the notion of trust, where he says that you develop trust, that it has something to do with interest, okay? And second, that it has something to do with an emotion, that it is going over and above. So when it's not simply the fact that I know that the other person shares my values, okay? This has the second part, and I put it in German because the English translation is so bad. I mean, it doesn't convey the sense of the German, but it simply says that you develop trust not simply by the fact that you know that the other is going to share your values, but that it is something over and above that knowledge, okay? So it's not simply a knowledge, it's something over and above, and he could use the term second nature. It is something which is more basic, which is about your body, okay? It's not simply about your thought. Now, the question is, okay? The question is, if he manages, okay? If he manages in his development of the idea of the community, of the nation, to take the interests of the single individuals into account, okay? That's what I'm asking myself. And now the idea, it's very promising because he really starts from the idea that people, they have desires and that they have life, that they have an interest, okay? But he's doing this in a very, now I have to say 2 words about the phenomenology because otherwise it's not going to make sense, but it's going to be very simple, okay? So what he is concerned with is with the question of truth, okay? So we come to notice that we cannot know the world as it is as such because we don't have access to the world as it is in itself, okay? The only thing that we can know is that the world depends upon our mind, okay? That we construct the world, okay? But then the fact that we construct the world so that we have self-consciousness still leaves us with the fact that the things that we perceive, the perceptions that we have, that we cannot say exactly what those, we cannot say if they're really true, okay? And therefore he believes that from the fact that we have that kind of self-consciousness, we develop the desire to understand and become, what he would say here, there must be what he would call, there must be a unity between the self-consciousness and the consciousness. Okay, so that we really must understand the truth of our perceptions. Okay, so we cannot just live with the fact that those perceptions that we have are somehow constructed by us, right? That they are made by us, but that they're not objective. Okay, and in order to get the objectivity, we are going to develop those desires. Okay, and those desires are going to help us to get that objectivity. And now, through the desires, we're going to consume objects. Okay, and through the fact that an object is going to satisfy my desire, I'm going to get an idea of certainty of myself, so that there is something right about my takings of the world, right? So because if, for example, if I drink water, right, and it is satisfying my desire, I got something right, okay? But what I do not get is that I really understand what water is, okay? That I go into the nature and understand the essential nature of water, okay? So that's a problem that remains. So I get self-certainty through getting out into the world and satisfying my desires, but I do not get the essential nature of the object, okay? Now, exactly what he would say, I mean, I give you just quotes from there that he says that even through the stance of desire, the object remains independent, okay? And now what happens? Now happens that now the question is really, how can I satisfy, how can I satisfy the desire of the self-consciousness for objectivity, okay? And he believes that the only way that you can satisfy that desire of the self-consciousness is when you meet another self-consciousness, okay? So when you get into touch with another self-consciousness. So why is that the case, right? So what he's saying is that there is a tradition in which from Descartes to Kant, which says that self-consciousness is going to give us the objectivity about the world. Now, Hegel, he thinks that this is wrong, okay? But he remains with the idea that we have to get the objectivity, that we have to get the truth, that we don't become skepticists, okay? Now, how do we get that objectivity? And he believes that the only way that we get the objectivity is through another self-consciousness, okay? Because another self-consciousness is not an object. It's not something which is in itself, right? It's always for itself. It is not an object like nature that I cannot access to. Another self-consciousness is like me, someone who is for itself and is someone who is in the same situation as me. And he believes now that if that other self-consciousness is recognizing my self-consciousness, is recognizing me, well, at this point then we get objectivity. Okay, 2 minutes, great. I was already terrorized by you, right? Okay. Okay, so at that point then we get objectivity, okay? So he believes that, but the point is, right, we get objectivity not only by each one of us keeping our own self-consciousness. We need to get identity of the self-consciousness because otherwise, of the different self-consciousness, because otherwise we would not get the objectivity, okay? So, and here the question is, how do we really get this objectivity, okay? So all the identity of the self-consciousness, okay? So all the challenges for Hegel to say how we really get the identity of the self-consciousness, right? And what he's saying there then, I have 2 minutes, okay, I have to wrap it up, okay. So what he's saying there is that we get this objectivity through struggles of recognition, right? So through struggle of the lordship and the bondsman. And and the point is, right? The point is, if really now if we can even buy his story, okay? If the objectivity that we get of the identity of the consciousness, the objectivity of the spirit, as you would call it, right? if that objectivity takes into account the interests of the people, right? And all the point is that they're going to need to struggle, that one kind of consciousness is going to prevail, okay? And this is a fight, right? I mean, he doesn't say, okay, we meet someone other and then, oh, lovely, I mean, we embrace each other and say, oh, that's the objectivity of this. No, he believes that's a fight because no one wants to give up on its own self-consciousness, okay? No one wants to do that. So you have to stop. So you have to do it. I will take 1 or 2 minutes more, okay? Okay. So you have to fight, right? And the point is, if you're going to, you're going to fight, right? And the question is, if at the end of that all story, it will be, we will really come up with a national spirit in which the interests of all the individuals are going to be taken into account, of all the individuals, are that it is an interest-based idea of the notion, okay? That it is a just idea of the notion, of the spirit. And the point is, like, you know, and I'm going to close with this, is that I believe that unfortunately, I really like this idea because it is Hegel. He doesn't let you go off the hook, right? I mean, he doesn't let you go and say, it's just simple pluralism and you do your thing. He doesn't let you go. He is really serious about that, right? To try to come, it's like with Jenny and Anne, right? In the example of Cheva. So she tried to come up with an idea, you know, that you really have to find a common idea. But I think it's, you know, the risk is really that the struggle ends up something what I described at the very beginning with left populism. I mean, that you just have, you know, different groups with different interests. They try to get their own, their hegemony, right? And that the nation, after all, is at the end the hegemony of one group, and it's never, well, it's never just in the sense that really it takes into account the interest, for example, of the poor. Therefore, I would say that because he has no indications about exactly what's the content of this. I mean, therefore, I would say that it is, you know, justice. The idea of justice is going to help the right populists much more than the idea of the nation, and that's it.
Thank you. Do we have any questions? You can go now.
Hi, thank you for that presentation. I wonder if that sounds different because I'm not Canadian, so maybe it sounds more sincere or less sincere. I don't know. Anyway, so yeah, I'm really interested in this idea of trust as being either a reflection of or comprised of interests, because my work is kind of analogous to that as well. And I was wondering if you think that what you said about sort of right-wing populism as, from what I understood, like a defender of a certain group's interests, if you think that is contingent on like an exclusionary interest, as opposed to like, oh, they also take my interests into account, or do they only take my interests into account? Yeah, so if you're talking about like trust in government or trust in politics or etc., like if it's an expectation that they only take your interests into account, or if they also take your interests into account. Does that make sense? I don't know if that was really clear. Like the exclusion aspect of it. Because I mean, I think this is, not to generalize, but I think this is sort of an issue where working class right-wing people feel left out to some degree and then throw like a protest vote. So I'm wondering if what they need is sort of only their own interests to be the sort of dominant thing. Anyway, thanks.
Now, I think what I said, because the resentment is justified, right? So if we live in a society, right? I think, if we live in, a society should take into account the interests of the least well off, okay? Or let's say as the working classes or the low skilled workers whatsoever. Because that's what a society is about after all, right? So if a society is just, if it leaves them, if a society makes policies, right? Like globalization does, which clearly, is going to somehow hurt them and is not doing anything about that, right? Does have no whatsoever idea of, like, look, they are going to be left behind by these policies. So I think that they're rightly angry. I think they're rightly angry. Yeah, with regard to other minority groups, you say, for example? Right, so the shut up of this would be that you can have globalization migration only insofar as the least well off, to some extent, insofar as the least well off are protected. Otherwise, you could not, otherwise I think they are right in order to be angry about you, okay? So, but if you're going to protect them, so if they're not going to suffer, because they are the only ones who actually suffer from both phenomena, right? Because the others are going to gain, right? Middle class and upper, they're going to gain from that.
Thanks very much, Volker. I really enjoyed that. I'm glad finally somebody mentioned Hegel. It's always good to leave on a high note. In terms of, I have a comment and a question. So the comment is, I'm not quite sure I agree with your description of the problem in the first instance. So somebody definitely has let certain parts of the population down, but what exactly has been going on there? And you said, well, what was it on your slide? Immigration and something else was bad for people. Yeah, so globalization, yes, definitely. But I mean, there are lots of other components there, right? So I think you could, especially with the people you mentioned in the literature, right? Your references. I think it's a fairly complex and nuanced picture where we probably could ask ourselves whether the response in general already to turn right makes sense. But what I really found convincing was that you said, well, the right-wing populists, they have a much more emotional response because they actually feel betrayed. That made a lot of sense to me. So here comes the question. Considering that you use Hegel, I was a bit surprised that you didn't make more of that tension between individualism and collective spirit, in particular in the phenomenology, right? And Hegel's history of philosophy as well. So one of the things which Hegel really dislikes about the French Revolution is that too strong focus on individual interests, right? The erosion of a public spirit, the erosion of Sittlichkeit, all that. So where that would, I think, actually fit quite nicely with some of the descriptions, and that's hence the link back to the comment, which we can see, which also went wrong in the system in the last 20, 25 years, right? So we have, for instance, right, private profits and the socialization of risk and losses and these kind of things. So can't you tie those more in, but then your story becomes slightly more complex, because it's then not that easy to say, well, the individual interests are not properly taken care of in a collective like the nation. I grant you that, yes, that's correct, but that's only half of the story, because it's not just about the interests of the individual. That's only 2/3 of the Hegel, and why do you leave the other third out?
The easy answer is that I got stuck with the self-consciousness chapter. That I mean, that was, I mean, did I really, I mean, it took me a long time to really understand. I mean, given the fact that I believe that he has a theory of the community and of the community and of identity. I mean, I think he's, I mean, really admire all the contemporary communitarians, but I think, you know, he has a really deep theory of and so what you say is that, well, I will have to, I really have to think about it, but what you say is that it's not just the fact that individual interest, so that kind of individualization, we have driven it too far now. Now we have to get back to the ethos, kind of what you were talking about. Now it's true. So as a matter of fact, and this is all true, I have really to go to that, to arrive at that point. But I still, you know, I still would say that the answer then is, I mean, the answer to the angry of the right populists is not going to be this kind of form of collective ethos in which individual interests, and you know what I mean by interests is desires, pleasures, and so forth, are sacrificed. So I don't, so I'm really Rawlsian. I mean, I'm kind of Rawlsian from the first generation, really, of the, so yeah, I really believe that, you know, that we have to take care of the individuals on that level there, on that very non-cognitive level, which is about, you know, which is that they feel safe, okay? So and the collective spirit is not going to help me to feel safe, but I see the point, and I see the point, and I.
Thank you, Volker. Exciting, Hegel. The other contact, I think I'm going to jump into Fabien's question there. Before he actually mentioned about the collective, he also mentioned that we have to make sure that the interest is not private interest, right? So it means that we cannot actually talk about groups, individuals. And at the end, don't you think that it's going to hurt the minority groups when we cannot talk about private interest? Because of course, private interest is part of a group interest. And then secondly, my question is that when we're trying to talk about interest, the sentence, the complete sentence is Interesse mit dem Ganzen, so with the whole, right? So the question with the whole, how can, yeah, so my interest with the whole, that can be quite dangerous for the democratic system that we have right now, don't you think? Because take an example for Singapore. Singapore is an advanced country. Everyone is really happy in Singapore, and they could create a whole idea of what we do here is we're going to do it for the people, but there's no democracy. So in the success of, you know, pulling the interests of the whole itself, will it actually kill the process of democracy?
About the last question, I think we talk about it separately because I'm not sure where, I'm not sure if I really understood it, but the one about the minorities now that's a cool thing about Hegel, okay? So that when the two self-consciousness meet, right? It's not that they, I mean, it's not that, you know, he believes that whoever you are and whoever I am, that we still have. So you can be whoever, I mean, he's not saying that only the Germans can find that spirit, or the Singaporeans and then the Chinese. He really thinks that whoever you are, whatever background you have, that kind of spirit, we can find it together, but we have, so no minorities, no. But not, can you say, but it's not because the majority is going to dominate the minorities. He just believes that you have to find an identity of the self-consciousness. Okay, so but then I agree that in fact this means that probably minorities get dominated. But the initial theoretical construct is not like this. He really believes, whatever you are, a minority or majority, that you have the obligation to find, or that you have the duty to find that common identity, okay? But as a matter of fact, what would be that common identity eventually might be, and I agree, it would be kind of a form of a domination. Back to you afterwards, okay?
Great, thanks. So 2 comments. So I'm no expert, but my impression is that the evidence for the claim that immigration drives down employment and salaries for working class people isn't that clear cut. It's not that clear cut. Yeah. The second comment is about rules and the interpretation of rules. And here I'm focusing on rules in a theory of justice. So there might be a change of mind over time and so on. But so you contrast Rawls's conception of trust with the claim that shared identity creates trust in some sense. But I think Rawls, at least in the theory of justice, where he claims that sharing a conception of justice, namely his, justice as fairness, and seeing it implemented in institutions will tend to create trust in other citizens, and in that way, those institutions will kind of provide their own support over time. It will be a stable arrangement. So, but I think that is actually a version of shared values generating trust, because he's assuming that sharing his liberal conception of justice will, and seeing it implemented in institutions, will generate trust. So it's about sharing values. It's not about sharing a national identity. It's about sharing liberal values, basically.
Well, you have justice. You know, the idea of Hegel before, what you said about shared values, it's whatever those values might be, given the fact that we are going to share those values, we are going, so that you have an identity among them, that we're going to develop trust. Now, I think Rawls, he's much more specific of that. He says, okay, those values can be whatsoever values. So the values that we have to share, it has to be a conception of justice, which is going to take into account the interests of the least well off. It's much more specific. So trust in a society doesn't just develop that they're going to share a common political conception. It has to be very, very clear and very specific common political conception. And without that, you're not going to have trust. And what you said about migration, now I know it's a complicated story, and I know also there is the studies in Florida when the Cubans came over to Florida. Yes. Now, that would be, it would be another paper to argue for that, and I could just argue it on a logical basis and not on a I'm not an economist, but what I want to say to you is like, okay, now imagine where are the immigrants are going to go to? Where are you going to live? Okay, and now I have the example of Rome, and they are basically living in the poorest neighborhoods. Okay, so now let's say now it's not a question of competition that they're driven out of jobs. Okay, let's say that's true, but still they're not going to live at the city center, right? They're living in the neighborhood. So that to some extent there is a burden. There is an unequal burden which is on poor people with migration. I think so. And which we don't actually realize most of the time. I mean, okay, there is this discussion on it, but there's the discussion about jobs, but there is the real fact that, that who has eventually to live really with them, and, to share a neighborhood with them, that's the least well off. I mean, that's the poorest people. Now, I'm not saying that this is, but anyway.
Just before you ask your question, we only have 4 minutes and there's quite a few questions left. We can go maybe a little bit over because the taxis have been late, but if we could keep them maybe a bit brief, that would be good.
I think my comment is a follow on from Fabien's, which is I was really interested to see the definition of trust. And what was distinctive to me about the definition was not that you need to take the interests of others seriously. You know, it's a confidence that they're taking your interests seriously. You know, what I read is quite an individualistic understanding of that locution, but he had said it's the fact that it presupposes a common identity of interest. So not just an alignment of interest, but the idea that we share the same unified interest or identification with a common good, and therefore there's some sort of what trust are, in my mind, it's trust is, oh, you're a part of the same group as me. We share this group interest because of our membership. And I think if trust is defined that way, then there's a really deep opposition between that concept of trust and the whole liberal project. Because the whole liberal project is not, you know, this neoliberal project, or maybe liberalism full stop, is not interested in the group at all and recognition of us all being participants in a group. It is consistent with the weak individual version of trust, where I care about your individual interests, but not about you as a qua member of some group, common group interest. Anyway, I just thought that there's a kind of exegetical question there vis-a-vis Hegel, and then there's a question, if my exegesis is right, is that something interesting that Hegel's saying for your project?
Yeah. So I would like to take you up on the last statement, with which you used to end your presentation, where you say, and I want to be sure I captured it correctly, you say the idea of justice will help the populace much more than the idea of the nation. And I totally understand, my reading, which I'm sure is, which you can confirm, is my reading of your presentation is that you're trying to answer the question of how do we make the idea of the nation a lot more, it's to address, the exclusionary, chauvinistic tendencies that are sort of embedded in the idea of the nation, and to expand beyond that. So that's sort of the basis on which I then want to ask this question, that to what extent do you think the idea of justice can really be separated from the idea of the nation? And I'm wondering that, isn't it perhaps an intuitive awareness of this strong connection between the idea of the nation and the idea of justice that is perhaps driving this strong attachment to the idea of the nation in the first place? So yes, there's the whole issue of, it being exclusionary and chauvinistic. There's that to deal with, yes. But at the same time, there's this whole, those strong connections don't exist in a vacuum, right? They play also a positive role. And I'm wondering, and of course, in using the word nation, it depends also on how it's conceptualized and all of that, but that's my sort of reaction to your presentation, and I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Just keep going. Okay, thank you for that presentation. I am no Hegel scholar, but I just wondered, you mentioned briefly struggles of recognition in Hegel, and I've always wondered about the relationship between recognition and political trust. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about belonging and political trust, but what about recognition? And I mean, is that within the Hegelian framework? Would that be, is there sort of an important relationship between the two?
Yeah, thanks. Just very briefly, then I just wanted to take you up on your reading of Hegel, because I think one important kind of Hegelian concept that we didn't mention here was that of mediation, but especially just in relation to Fabian's question about the individual and the collective. Of course, the way in which Hegel likes to resolve this is to say that, but it's not that we need to, return to Sittlichkeiten, a thick form of community, nor to succumb to excessive individualism, but this will be mediated by institutions, especially the institutions of a Rechtsstaat, right, the system of rights. And I think that is kind of the answer to the problem that you had, which was that, oh, well, how is this not just going to be a kind of endless fight for hegemony? Well, what Hegel thinks is that it is, like a Prussian type system of rights, a Rechtsstaat, that will mediate those conflicts and create channels for upholding like a stable society. Importantly, that's not a democracy. So your comment was spot on. Right? Hegel is not a Democrat, but I think that's where he ends up being actually very kind of Rawlsian in a sense, that that there will be background institutions which generate, if not a kind of alignment of interests or anything like that, but ways to mediate conflicts in such a way that actually embodies a notion of freedom and justice.
Okay, so let me take it in the reverse order, just because I remember what you said. Now that's true. That's true. I mean, but at the same time, what he says is like the state. It's like just the institutionalization of inequality. So it's the institutionalization of freedom, and he's But still, we have to understand how from the struggles of recognition, we really, each one of us, as a matter of fact, is going to accept the freedom of each other. I mean, that's another story. If he's managing to get freedom as he wants it to get, okay? So that's one story. But once we get freedom, and the only thing that he wants to get is the freedom, okay? Individual freedom, as you rightly say, not in terms of democracy, not in terms of political rights, but in terms of economic rights, right? In terms of civil society. And the point is, and he makes it very clear, this is just, it's the institutionalization of inequality, of strong inequality. It's the state who creates inequality. That freedom that I grant to you, it's the foundation of inequality. Without that, I would not have that kind of inequalities. So from what I say is like that it's not mediating the interests of that even the end point of the Prussian state is not going to mediate the individual interests. I don't think so, but I see it.
Volker, I'm going to be mean to you and put a little time limit on you.
Absolutely, Kara.
If we could try and get it answers within the next 3 to 4 minutes, that'd be appreciated.
Yeah, no. I always thought when I saw the stop sign that I should activate my Italian self and say, well, stop doesn't have no meaning to me. I mean, just like, well, but I have a German side where I get it. Okay, so anyway, now let me see. So Caroline, this is let me see, because Folak is you're a little bit easier for me to answer than because that's a very difficult question. Now, so you ask about justice and the nation and if they are not tied together. So, the idea of Ross it's a wonderful idea. Okay, it's a wonderful idea. It says, okay, if a society is just, those business people, elite, they probably would go for something like globalization, but they would go, but since they have, because what he believes is that the principles of justice, you develop a sense of justice. So you're developing guilt if you're going to violate. So that they will voluntarily and be concerned with the fate. I mean, it's not that you it's not that that they could not leave the contract, that they cannot get away. Okay, it is that they emotionally do not manage to get away. So they a social contract, after all, is a freedom. I mean, you make a contract with each other, it's based upon our freedom, so I could leave that contract whenever I want, right? But he believes that if it's a contract based upon the principle of justice, that you will develop those emotions that whenever, whenever I could leave it because it would be in my interest, I would not do it because I will feel guilty because I will let you down, okay? And that emotion, the only thing that keeps up the contract is the emotional level. And here the nation, it's, now he's going to have a very, he has a counterfactual understanding, but the nation is not necessary. I mean, now it doesn't matter. I mean, the fact is that it doesn't matter that you really have to share a common history whatsoever, okay? Because even if you share a common history, you could just, if society is going to get really unequal and unjust at some point, there will be some form of strong conflict. And so that the nation is not going to do any kind of work, okay? Now, wait, what do you say? Yes, wait, Nick, that's a complicated question. Yeah, so I would say Caroline and Nick, we're going to talk. We're going to talk in the bus to the fireplace, okay?
Thank you all for your questions. Thank you, Volker.
Thank you.
So this is kind of the end of the conference part of the workshop. So I really want to thank both of the student assistants for the 3 days of assisting, and yeah. It's not easy to herd academics to, respect time constraints, etc. I also really want to thank Mira again for having chipped in all the preparatory work, even though she had a lot of other things on her plate, and especially Dimitri, who've done really all the work on the ground, which is like that's most of the work. Then our de-stressors, Kathy and Stephanie, who've done all of the technology and have ensured that we will be able to share some of this online. So I would like to thank you as well. This is really, for us, for the organizers, really helpful. Last thing, no thank yous, but next step. So what we will do is we will have a panel discussion where some of you will participate as audience. Others will participate as panelists. We will get taxis which take you to Signal Hill. Signal Hill, we will go to 2 different places depending on what you want to do. So those of you who have good juice, who want to take a small walk, we will take up to the Signal Hill, I think it's called National Historic Site, right? So, and I would ask, so I'm accompanying that group. We will go there, you will have a wonderful view over the city, and then we will take a 10 to 15 minute walk down to the conference center. So I would ask first those people who want to do that in a second to lift their hand so that I know for whom to wait up there before walking down. And I also ask those people to take the first taxis because we need more time. The other group who doesn't want to walk, the taxis will take you straight to the Harris Center, which is a conference center where the panel and the reception will take place, and Dimitri will be there and take care of you there. So now, please, who wants to take the first cabs and go up the hill? Dimitri, what's the walk like? Yeah, it's down. Yeah, it's paved. Okay, so okay, who doesn't want to go? Okay, yeah, I think we can take the bag without you. Okay, so basically I will. Yes, and we walk down. You can do both. Yes, so we will walk, so we have an hour. So what we will do is we will drop you off at the hill. walk down, go to the panel. That is it. Yes. Okay, so basically I just do not, for the Mon people, I'm not waiting for them. Yes, yes, it's downhill.